$23 million is a sum that could certainly make a big difference in the world's most troubled places.
It's also the amount of money which has been spent putting an artwork on the ceiling of a UN building in Geneva. And as Andrew Potter reports, spending money on art, not relief, has not gone down well with everyone.
It's an artwork already being compared to that of Michelangelo in the Sistine Chapel. This vast explosion of colours being revealed on the ceiling of the UN's Palace of Nations building in Geneva. At 1,500 square metres, it's as striking as it is expensive. The work costing $23 million, paid for by the Spanish government and Spanish sponsors.
This is yet another demonstration of Spain's enduring commitment to the values and missions of the United Nations.
Spanish abstract artist Barcelo took more than a year to complete the project. 100 tons of paint was blasted over stalactites of torn aluminium. The Spanish government paid 40% of the $23 million price tag, but more than 600,000 of that comes from the country's budget for overseas development aid. And that's outraged Spain's conservative opposition.
At a time when there is so much need in the world, that money could have been used for hundreds of thousands of vaccines, water wells, mobile health units.
Barcelo is one of Spain's best-known artists. His works are likened to those of Pablo Picasso and Joan Miró. The Spanish government refuses to say how much Barcelo was paid for the work, and in the capital Madrid, feelings are mixed.
On the one hand, it's a good thing because it helps to support culture in general, but on the other, if part of the funds for the work were meant to go to developing nations, then that's wrong.
If we're pursuing a real aid policy, then let's actually help those people, and let's not waste money in self-promotion.
Spain's foreign minister has rubbished suggestions the money to create this work will prevent the country helping those in need. And he says art has no price. Andrew Potter, Al Jazeera.
But is there a political price? An exciting work of art or way too expensive? To discuss it, I'm joined here in London by art historian Richard Cork and Hillel Neuer, the executive director of UN Watch in Geneva. Hillel, let's start with you. What are the issues as you see them here?
Well, as someone who participates regularly in the Human Rights Council debates, I can tell you that we did need a better room. But spending $23 million, with a portion of that coming from aid money dedicated to feeding starving children in Africa, it all seems quite frivolous and frankly sends absolutely the wrong message.
So, Richard, pretty much in a nutshell, isn't it? Frivolous, other people have called it inappropriate, extravagant, just some of the criticism.
Well, the first thing I'd say is that I don't think there's anything frivolous about art. I think that's got to be kind of made quite clear. When we look back into the history of art, we can see that some of the greatest things ever done in the history of civilization can be called art, and were actually done on ceilings, most notably the Sistine Chapel at the Vatican in Rome, where Michelangelo painted something that everybody marvels at, wherever they come from, however old or young they are. It's one of those staggering feats of the imagination which we all value hugely. Yes. So it doesn't have to be frivolous.
Paid for that, didn't they? We're talking about the United Nations here, Rich. We're talking about an organisation that's established to help the poor and needy around the world. So this really is an unnecessary extravagance, isn't it?
Well, I don't think there's anything wrong with the idea of getting an artist to decorate a major building like the UN in Geneva. Where I think probably the calculation has gone awry is the sheer massiveness of the figure involved. I mean, that does surprise me, actually. I do wonder why someone like Barcelo, whom I've known for years as an artist, I wonder why he commands such a vast fee, actually. I don't really quite understand that.
He is not internationally recognised as yet on a scale. Hillel, does this show, do you think, a political naivety by the United Nations? They did, in all honesty, cancel a press conference because they realised the trouble they were getting into. But Ban Ki-moon seems totally removed from this.
Well, I don't think Ban Ki-moon was involved, but look, it is symbolic of what has become. He was, as was the King of Spain and others.
Yeah.
Look, I think it's symbolic of what has become of the Human Rights Council itself, a 47-nation body which is full of hot air and rhetoric, but little action for the victims of human rights who need it most. You know, today, UN Watch, my organization, and Freedom House called for the UN leaders to convene an emergency session for victims who are under serious threat in Congo, to use today's international moment to help the victims who need it most. They failed to do so. The fact is that the Human Rights Council in the past 2 years has systematically eliminated human rights monitoring in Belarus, Cuba, Liberia, actually in the Congo several months ago, as well as Darfur, and few monitors remain. So this is what has become of the Human Rights Council 60 years after Eleanor Roosevelt and René Cassin drafted the Universal Declaration. And so really the extravagance and the frivolousness, the frivolity of what happened today in Geneva is symbolic of what has become of the Human Rights Council.
Richard, it does show political naivety. We all know the song "Art for Art's Sake, Money for God's Sake." But, I mean, is that a Philistine's view, or this was just unnecessary, wasn't it? 23 million, and it's a bit much to compare with the Sistine Chapel, even though this did take a year to create.
Well, if you haven't actually seen the work of art in question, all I've seen is colour reproductions. And I can guess that there's something to do with the sheer size of it. The impact of it when you go in there might be pretty special, as might also be the whole notion of creating these. I gather he used aluminium first of all, and then
the aluminium was a framework.
Yeah, that's right, like a sculptural framework,
yeah.
and then he sprays it with tons and tons, yeah, tons and tons of paint, so it becomes kind of encrusted.
I mean, what's his carbon footprint for a start? for an artist.
So then you get a kind of multicoloured stalactite effect, I suppose, which actually quite appeals to me.
But suitable for a UN building? I mean, okay, so if an industrialist wants to commission a piece of work, fine. It's nobody's business but theirs.
Yeah.
But for the United Nations, it's sending all the wrong messages, and people are immediately saying you could spend the money on vaccines, you could spend the money on the poor, people are starving. Oh, we've just seen pictures tonight from all over the world of people who need that money more than an artist.
Sure. Well, I do think that it sounds as if it's far too expensive. But I will also very hastily add, as someone who writes about art and cares about art a lot, that if you go down the road of saying that there are always starving people, there are always dialysis machines, there are always something to spend money on, and you can't justify ever spending money on anything else, you end up with no culture at all. You have to be very careful with that argument.
It's a very wrong political message as well, isn't it? Because immediately the project's got off to the wrong start, Hillel, because this project was aimed at increasing dialogue between the West and the Muslim world. That was the aim of the project. And that's been lost completely, hasn't it?
Well, there's a certain irony here. You're quite right. And there's a certain irony here in that the name given to this new chamber, which is supposed to house the Human Rights Council, is the Chamber for Human Rights and Alliance of Civilizations, which, as you noted, is a reference to Islam and the West. Now, of course, the Human Rights Council is the venue where the Islamic states repeatedly introduce resolutions that curtail basic freedom of expression in order to protect what they call attacks that defame religion and defame symbols and prophets, a reference to the Danish cartoons and other developments that are deemed to offend Islamic sensitivities. And in fact, Islam and the West clash repeatedly with this Islamic campaign against freedom of expression at the Human Rights Council. So it is kind of ironic that these serious clashes, and tomorrow in New York there will be one of these resolutions at the General Assembly, but the site and venue of these clashes will be housed in a chamber that purports to be about alliance. Well, really the chamber should be about individual human rights.
As I know, there's very little sign of irony ever in Geneva. Hillel Neuer, thank you very much indeed, and also Richard Cork, thank you.
Thank you.
Well,